the year 1934, when Popper published his first book in German, Logik der Forschung, or the logic of investigation or scientific investigation, and with his falsification principle. But after that, he planned perhaps to stay in Austria and to continue with his scientific work. But the events in Austria went in such a direction that he decided to leave Austria. And he was right, because when he left Austria in 1937, and went to New Zealand, to Christchurch University, where the university which finished Ernst Rutherford, a famous English physicist. Why did he do it? He thought that would be prudent to leave Austria, and he was right, because a year later, in 1938, Austria was united with Germany, Nazi Germany, and Popper, because he was a Jew, could have suffered um, uh, by the Germans, because Germans at that time already had so-called Nuremberg laws, which restricted the rights of Jews in all Germany. Okay, so now with the unification of Austria and Germany, the same laws could be applied to Jews in Austria too. So Popper was happy that he sort of left Austria and was spared of these troubles, and he found himself in New Zealand. So he had to change language, because New Zealand is a English-speaking country. So the Christchurch is a part of New Zealand. It's a city in New Zealand. So Christchurch University, they speak only English, and you have to teach students in English. Well, you know, the same as what I'm doing here. Yes, Javad. Yes. Oh, Angel. So I'm teaching you in English. Yes. So the same was the predicament of Karl Popper. He had to teach his students in English. So he had to master English language. So he changed the language of his, like all other publications. So that's why I've told you already that his first German book, Logik der Forschung, reappeared after the war in English variant, which was written by Karl Popper himself. He didn't translate this book from German into English. He just wrote another book in English. Okay, so so he was, and during his stay in New Zealand, he not only continued his research in the history of science, but he wrote the book of much broader, I would say, content and message. It was the book which is called The Open Society and Its Enemies. I will speak about this book, Society and Its Enemies. Well, what is that open society? So open society is the opposed to closed society or totalitarian society, the society in which we have no freedoms, or freedom of citizens are restricted, freedoms are restricted. So, sorry, not enemy, but enemies. I'm sorry. The I will write again. The open society. Mm, So you see how I can be easily falsified. So maybe that's why maybe the inferiority complex is somewhere here present. And its enemies. Well, who likes to be falsified or caught by the hand and saying that's a blatant mistake of yours, blatant mistake of yours, okay? So the open society and its enemies, because the enemies are many, okay? The open society is one and it has many enemies, okay? So who are the enemies of the open society. The enemies are, as Popper wanted to hint, Stalinism or Soviet dictatorship, and Nazism or Hitlerism. So two great enemies of the open society. But Popper was not just a political publicist or political journalist. He wanted to make an investigation. So he wanted to see the roots of all these ideologies. So you remember that Marx was very dependent on Hegel. So Hegel was the ideology which sort of inspired Karl Marx. Okay, so Popper wanted to dig more deeply in this question. So he decided to study Hegel and to see that perhaps maybe in Hegel there are the roots of this totalitarianism. Okay, and he found it. So you can read it and you will. The same was a procedure he made with Plato. You remember that Plato formulated this ideal state where there are three castes or three types of citizens: philosophers, warriors, and peasants. Well, it resembles a little bit India with its four castes of Brahmins and Kshatriyas and Vaishya and Shudra. Okay, am I right, or you pronounce it in other way, Anshita? How you pronounce Brahmins?
We call it Brahmins or Brahman.
Brahmin. They're,
Shudra.
they're the highest caste, okay?
Yes, but
And
yeah.
then follows Kshatri, yes?
Huh? Kshatriya.
Yes. These are the warriors, okay?
No, these
Not
are the
exactly.
warriors.
Ah, well, fallibilism is a little bit different. Fallibilism is that I will give you an explanation. I'm sorry. Well, here I found the definition of fallibilism. So that the truth that no beliefs are certain. So we can say Karl Popper, in which sense he's the father of fallibilism also. This is not exactly, this is not the synonym of falsification. Fallibilism is can be formulated briefly in this way, that all theories can be divided in uh, in wrong and not yet falsified. So you see that we cannot say that there is a true theory. So every theory is just probably true. It can be in principle falsified in future. So for fallibilist, there's nothing certain in this world, only probable. You understand that? And if you say, for example, belief, like belief in God, it is just non-scientific, because the belief in God cannot be either proved or disproved. So you cannot find a crucial experience in which you will say, no, God doesn't exist. For example, you pray to God and God doesn't answer your prayer. Is it the disproof of your faith? No. It means that God has some secret plans for you, that he doesn't answer your prayer. For example, usually the believers give such an example, that a young boy saw how his grandfather took the artificial chin out of his mouth and put it into a cup before he goes to sleep. And this young boy of 4 years old, he prayed to God, oh, please, God, send me this artificial chin, that I could put it into the cup before I sleep. And later, when this boy have grown up, he said, "Well, how I'm pleased that God didn't hear my this childish prayer, and I can and sort of left me my teeth so that I could live with them." Okay, so this is typically this. If you hear a preacher, he will say that this is an example that our prayers perhaps are not answered because God has something more in store for us. Okay, but Popper would say that means that in principle, religion cannot be sort of disproved, and it means that it is outside science. Okay, this is not scientific. Well, to a certain extent, many people do agree with that, and they say that there is some gulf between science and religion. So religion is one part of me and science is another part of me, and these parts are incommensurable, so they cannot be sort of understood. There's no like uh, correspondence principle between them. Okay, so they are like two parts of your say existence. Well, this is difficult, and Popper himself, he didn't say that he's an atheist. He preferred to call himself agnostic. Okay, so well, that's agnosticism or skepticism is, according to Popper, this the unique position which can be accepted by a philosopher. Now, returning to the open society and its enemies. So, enemies of the open society are people who believe in absolute truths, like Plato, who thought that his ideal of the state is a true ideal. So every state should imitate this ideal. Okay, for Plato, the ideal is objectively true thing, and these ideas exist somewhere in the ideal world. And here we also only have imperfect sort of shadows of these ideas, and that is why we should sort of, there is somewhere the source of absolute truth, and we should find it. Okay, Popper thought, or Popper argued that this position leads to totalitarianism, because if you have absolute truth, you can sort of kill and torture your enemies because they are in falsehood, so they are inferior to you. Or you can put them to prison, for example. And he found in Plato's, another Plato's dialogue, the laws, he found exactly this situation when Plato suggests that those who disagree with the Platonic philosophy should be put to prison in order to convince them in the falsehood of their position. Okay, so this is ideological persecution for the sake of ideology. That's what Plato recommends in his ideal state. Okay, so for Popper it is unacceptable. Well, this criticism of Plato, it is the first volume of this book, and the criticism of Hegel and Marx forms the second volume of this book. So this book was published in two volumes. It appeared in shortly after the war in 1945. That book it was published in English and was written already in English. So you can see that for those 8 years which he spent in New Zealand, Popper mastered English very well. This book made a sensation and was widely, how to say, advertised and made him famous. So when he managed to return to England and receive a prestigious post of professor of philosophy in London School of Economics, a post which he held, I think, for about 30 years. Well, you can see the details of Popper's biography in every encyclopedia article on him. I will not just here bother you with these details. What I want to mention is that the year after his book was published, namely in 1946, he was invited to Cambridge to give a presentation on his new books and also on the so-called moral problems or problems in science. And first of all, moral problems, which was at that time, Popper was preoccupied with morality. He thought that the Second World War happened because of moral decay of Europe. And he wanted to pose the problems of morality, and he wanted all the scientists to be mobilized in order to create a new morality for this open society, for democracy. Otherwise, this sort of bloody wars could repeat. In order for them not to repeat again, he wanted to uh, put the problems of morals. Well, with this intention, he went to Cambridge. And unhappily for him, the proceedings were presided by Wittgenstein. And you remember from the previous lecture how Wittgenstein was skeptical about moral problems being solved by pure logic. He said that perhaps about these problems you should better keep silence because they cannot be like addressed in a proper logical way. Okay. Of course, later Wittgenstein was somehow a little bit took a more mild position. He said that perhaps we can deal with problems of morals and religion, but only in frames of so-called language games. So we can sort of formulate some axioms or rules in which we can deal with these problems, like chess rules. You remember we spoke about a knight and a pawn, and these are all artificial constructions. But if you take these rules, you can play chess and enjoy chess, okay? So of course, also you can enjoy love. For example, if you just define the rules, how you will behave with your future wife, okay? If you agree both that you will not transcend certain rules in your like in your marriage, so you can perhaps live a happy marriage till you will become old people, okay? But if you will just act against the rules, for example, beat your wife, you understand? Well, according to some rules, you can beat your wife, okay? So, for example, say in Islam, there is no prohibition of beating your wife, strictly speaking. But Wittgenstein and Popper were against absolute rules. Okay, so they said, well, Islam or no Islam, or Christianity or no Christianity, but you yourself develop a set of rules which you will follow in your private life with your husband. Maybe he will be a Muslim, but you will ask him, please, of course, I know that according to your religion, it is permitted for you to beat your wife. But I ask you, give me a private assurance that you will never sort of beat me, okay? Attack me physically, okay? And he will give you an individual promise that he will never attack you, okay? So this is like your own language game, or you understand, it's your own set of rules, okay? It doesn't pretend, you don't pretend that you found a new religion or you are speaking from heaven. This is just your human agreement, okay? Like we have an agreement that Anshita runs the Zoom conferences. This is our agreement, you understand? This is not that prescribed in some heavenly rules, okay? This is not a revelation from above. It is just human agreement, okay? So according to Popper, this is the only thing we have. And according to Wittgenstein also. So I don't understand why did they quarrel. But in fact, they quarreled. Why? Because Popper while speaking about morals, he was acting against his own convictions. His convictions are convictions of tolerance, but he spoke Popper in such a way as if he was a heavenly messenger. These all pupils of Popper remember his trait that when he was speaking like a domineering person. He didn't like to be contradicted. He was always patronizing, you understand? And perhaps this was irritated Wittgenstein. And he said, give me an example of moral problems that you are going to say to, because for Wittgenstein, the moral problems, of course, exist, but they cannot be spoken of in a logical way. So you can only suggest people like a remedy to just some, how to say, consensus or some agreements, okay? Not pretending on objective validity. But it seems that Wittgenstein saw in Popper something of a, like, of a, say, of an example of kind of totalitarianism of democracy, you understand? So you see, democracy can also be totalitarian in certain sense. This is the later will be called paradox of tolerance. So you see, if you are if you are proclaiming tolerance, then you can ask whether this tolerance will embrace also those who are against tolerance. For example, fascists. Okay, you understand? Or communists. Communists are against tolerance. They say, we will not be tolerant. If we come to power, we will put you to prison because all of you are spies of imperialistic countries. We'll show you, you understand, how we should deal with you. So now, if people just openly sort of, how to say, uh, threaten us that if they will come to power, they will put us to prison. So perhaps is it possible to tolerate them in a democratic country? So maybe just dissolve these communist or fascist parties and just don't let them sort of frighten us. You understand? With their sort of, you understand, threats. So this is paradox of tolerance. So if you want to be tolerant, then what are the borders of your tolerance? Okay, can you be tolerant to the intolerant? Okay, so of course, Wittgenstein, being a good logician, he immediately sensed these weak points of Popper's position. So he started sort of to be skeptical. At first, when just Popper started to speak, it was in October 1946. I repeat, it was in Cambridge. It was a session of so-called ethical society, informal organization, of course. Bertrand Russell was also present at that conference. So Wittgenstein was skeptical and ironically asked Karl Popper, give me an example of one single moral problem, because Popper said he will be speaking about moral problems. And Popper said, well, at that time, Wittgenstein was holding a poker, you understand, a poker in his hands, because there was like a fire, you know, this fire in many English homes at that time. There was this like a oven, okay? I don't know how they call it, Englishmen. Um, I will see. Um, maybe this exact word. Well, they say fireplace or grate or hearth is. Um, You see, there's a lot of variants to translate it. So I will put it in fireplace. Yes, exactly. Uh, well, chimney, fireplace or grate or hearth. Well, these are the examples, okay? So maybe let's call it fireplace, okay? So there was a fireplace in that room, and Wittgenstein was holding a poker just maybe to arrange the ashes or the wood in this fire or the coals in this fireplace, okay? And well, when he started speaking with Popper, show me an example of one single moral problem, he seemed to point with this poker in the direction of Popper. Not, of course, he wanted to hurt him, but Popper used this as a pretext for a joke. And he said, well, this is the example of a moral problem. If you can sort of scare the invited lecturer with the poker, okay? Or just, you understand, um, well, threaten, if you can threaten to an invited lecturer with a poker. So Wittgenstein took this joke very seriously, got enraged, threw the poker into the fireplace, went out of the room and slapped the door, okay? So this was a little scandal. After that scandal, um, Bertrand Russell, who was present and who invited Popper to speak, he took presidency he became a chairman of the meeting, and so Popper continued to speak. Of course, there's like everybody has a like aftertaste. You understand, though the situation was a little bit had a certain well, it was not very pleasant, but they, as being English gentlemen, they did the most to finish it smoothly. So Popper ended his discussion. But of course, this scandal was sort of remained in the history of philosophy under the name of Wittgenstein's poker. So there's even an article in Wikipedia, you can read it, Wittgenstein's poker, where all the details are given. Well, this is what I promised you to tell this in the beginning, that the biographies of Wittgenstein and Popper are intertwined. Well, of course, it is only an episode. After that, Popper continued his successful career in England, and he had one talented young um, pupil whose name was George jo, jo, George Soros. Well, maybe some of you know him. He's one of the richest men in the world, I think, now, George Soros. He was at that time, he was only 17. He barely escaped Hungary because he was a Jew and could be put to extermination camp. But he managed to somehow to survive under a false name. I don't know how. So after this horror of the Second World War, he came to England to study economics in London School of Economics. And he fell somehow in love or was attached very much to Karl Popper, who was a teacher of philosophy, not of economics. But he produced such a great impression on George Soros. Then later, when George Soros started his philanthropic activities, he named his foundation the Open Society Foundation. So in the remembrance of that book of Karl Popper, The Open Society and Its Enemies. So you can find, I think it still exists, this foundation, Open Society. It sort of gives grants for humanitarian investigations also in former Soviet Union. Now it is outlawed in Russian Federation, but I remember the period when it worked and helped a lot of scientists, especially philosophers, economists, and others. But now it is not longer functioning in Russia, but maybe it functions in other East European countries like Poland and Hungary. I don't know. Just you can look. So this is like one of the like how to say results of Karl Popper's activities. So he was quite popular. See, among also very wealthy and influential men. Well, he himself was not a wealthy person. He just was a normal professor, a very successful one. And his like hobby was writing books. So I've told you that he already sort of have rewritten his book Logik der Forschung and published it under the name The Logic of Scientific Discovery. But he wrote also other books and also gave lectures. And in one of those lectures, he introduced the interesting concepts: World One, uh, World Two, and World Three. So three world concepts. What is that? Just a few words because not much time is left. Just a brief introduction into these three worlds of Popper because it is in the program. So world three. So what are these three worlds? World one is just the world of inanimate nature. So it's just nature such, without man and his, without taking into consideration man and his consciousness and the products of man's creativity. So if we see a bird, for example, um, uh, so bluebird, for example, yes, bluebird or a swan, then you can see this is part of world one because swans and bluebirds and say sparrows were not created by man. But if you see an aircraft, this will be part of world three, or world of technology, world which was made by man. Now what is world two? World two is man himself, not his body, but his brain. His because Karl Popper developed friendship with a certain Australian neurophysiologist, John Eccles, who was later received Nobel Prize in in medicine. So John Eccles was a very peculiar man. He was a Roman Catholic, a believer, and he believed that there is a certain like governing structure which is like supervises over the brain. So it's more than brain, it's something spiritual. Well, of course, it's for materialists, it's nonsense. But you remember that Karl Popper was open and tolerant, and he had just friends because when he was giving lectures in New Zealand, John Eccles helped him and was his friend, okay? So somehow helped him. So they remained friends in spite of these differences, Popper being an agnostic and John Eccles being a Catholic and a Christian. So this friendship developed and they started to sort of argue or just to make a dialogue. And they published the book together, The Self and Its Brain. The Self and its brain. So not the soul, but the self and its brain. So the book was published together by Popper and Eccles. You can see it is still, I think, in Google Books, you can find it. So in this book, there was this idea that self is something different from world one. It's not just nature, it's something more than nature, okay? So Popper decided to call this self or soul or whatever we can, personality, human, only human personal. He decided to call it world two. And so now we have three worlds. World one, it's just world of nature. World two is the world of human, say, soul or human self. Better just to not to use this word soul, which savors of religion. So just use the word self. Okay, and world three is the world produced by human creativity. Okay, so it is technology, also art, also architecture, also books, and even lectures. And even the internet is also can be called world three. Okay. Well, more or less that's all. So you see that Karl Popper developed a lot of interesting concepts, and also he's known for his position, which is called critical realism. Critical realism. So he was not a second positivist because second positivists were not realists. Well, Popper considered himself a realist in a sense of Lenin. So there's objective reality. Only the problem is that Lenin knew or pretended to know what is this objective reality and what is objective truth. While Popper said that we will always only probably guess about this objective reality. We'll never find exact access to this objective reality, but it exists. It exists, but it cannot be sort of, we cannot get information about it with precision. Only what is left for us is probability. Okay, so here also is something paradoxical, of a paradox. If you call yourself a realist, so you believe in objective reality, but how can you prove your belief? Okay, so it seems that Popper takes a contradictory position. So he should, uh, well, you remember Ernst Mach, he was critical of realistic position. And he was, in this sense, he was like logically consistent, the second positivism. The position of Popper seems to be not so consistent because if he calls himself a realist, how can he get this concept and how can it be verified or falsified? Okay, so it remains part of a certain belief. The same way, those beliefs in moral problems that people, that say men have this possibility of putting and solving moral problems. This cannot, of course, be proved either from nature or from logic. So, of course, here is a weak point of Popper's philosophy. But as a personality, open, gentlemanly, well, maybe a little patronizing, that according to the reminiscences of his pupils, he was fond of patronizing, but he also helped his pupils a lot. So we will speak about that when we'll speak about Paul Feyerabend. This will be our next lecture. So we will again return to problem of Popper. Now I'm saying you goodbye. Thank you for listening to me. Thank Anshita for hosting us today. And I hope your like your moods are not sort of spoiled by my lecture. Okay, so I wish you a good evening and hope to meet you next Saturday. Okay.
It was a pleasant lecture.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you,
Okay.
Prof.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Yeah.
Have a
Bye-bye.
nice weekend.
Goodbye. Yes,
Have a nice week.
I think it was
Have a nice weekend.
it was a pleasure to meet you. Okay. Okay. Goodbye.
Thank you
Goodbye,
so
everybody.
much for your lecture.
Bye.
Left.